All right, since today is pajama day, this is what I would wear if we actually had pajama day. See my big wink wink. All right, so I'm going to do my read aloud from Three Good Deeds, Chapter 5. Excuse me. Little recap. When we left off, Howard was complimenting Moonlight Gives Her Down a Silver Glow, and asked if the old witch had put a spell on her, and she said no, it was a human boy who turned her feathers red, remember? And that was when Howard realized that the red sheen wasn't from something reflecting on her. Moonlight gives her hair a silver glow. Oops. Moonlight gives her down a silver glow, wore exactly the same red color as his mother's newly dyed woolens. Chapter 5, read. Oh, Howard said. Moonlight gives her down a silver glow. Head drooped. Sorry. Her body slouched. Her tail feathers sagged. She shuffled backward into the weeds again. Sorry, she mumbled, as though her appearance was an offense. You won't call me names, will you, after all? She asked in a honk that trembled. I know I look ridiculous. You won't tell the others? I said I wouldn't, Howard reminded her. Then he realized what she'd said about the others. He asked, Have you been hiding since this happened? I was hoping it would go away. Moonlight Gives Her Down a Silver Glow sighed. Before anybody saw me. Of course it will go away, Howard assured her, knowing that dyes fade. Eventually. Usually. He saw her perk up and thought that surely for a goose who spent so much time in the water, the dye would fade sooner rather than later. Except, of course, that she wasn't going into the water for fear of being seen and laughed at. She could spend the whole summer long hiding in the weeds. But, he said, and saw the hope fade from her eyes. So he changed to, but meanwhile you look fine. You look different in a good way. You look exotic and... What he wanted to say was that she looked, between gray-brown feathers and red dye, like a moth-eaten tea cozy. Instead, he finished, you look interesting. Moonlight Gives Her Down a Silver Glow, poked her head back out from among the weeds. Interesting, she replied. Is that good? It would be easy to make her feel bad, but it was just as easy to make her feel good. Absolutely, Howard said. Some goose was paddling around in the pond and noticed Howard. Hey, this goose said. You're new. You need to come introduce yourself. Howard turned to this other goose. I'm not staying long, he explained. He very much hoped he wouldn't be staying long. The other goose craned his neck to see around Howard. Who's that with you? He asked. Moonlight? Is that you? This, said Howard, waddling out of the way to let the goose in the pond see Moonlight Gives Her Down a Silver Glow, is... What was another way to say red? This is Sunset. Sunset was obviously way too short. A name to replace something like Moonlight Gives Her Down a Silver Glow needed to be longer. Howard cleared his throat. Luckily, when a goose clears his throat, there's a lot of throat to clear, and this gave Howard a lot of time to think. He started again. This is Sunset Shining. Excuse me. Sunset dances like flames. Inspired, he finished all in a rush. On her feathers. Sunset dances like flames on her feathers. Isn't she beautiful? Oh, I like that, whispered the goose, formerly known as Moonlight Gives Her Down a Silver Glow. Thank you. Perhaps it was that not many people had had occasion to say thank you to Howard. He felt a bubbling sensation. Not exactly good, not exactly bad, but definitely strange. That started inside. Then, in the space of 4 or 5 heartbeats, grew and burst through his skin with such force that he looked down at himself to see if his feathers were rippling. From behind him came a voice, a human voice. See, that wasn't so hard, was it? The old witch was standing with a basket over her arm. She reached in and tossed a handful of breadcrumbs into the pond. Sunset dances like flames on her feathers, dove into the water, and she and the other goose began gobbling up the soggy bread. What wasn't so hard? Howard demanded. Doing a good deed, said the old witch. Complimenting a goose is a good deed? Asked Howard. Making her feel better is. Howard considered that notion while the witch reached into her basket and threw out more crumbs. So, the bubbly feeling was the boy into goose spell starting to come apart. He wondered if he would look 1/3 boy and 2/3 goose, because that would be very weird. Though it might make doing the remaining 2 good deeds easier. But no, he still looked entirely goose. Other geese had heard the happy honking and splashing of Sunset Dances Like Flames on Her Feathers and the other goose and were beginning to swim their way. Howard took a deep breath, then another. Then he said to the old witch, "Have I mentioned what lovely eyes you have?" He waited for the bubbly feeling to indicate the spell loosening up further. Nothing. "Nice try," the old witch said, with a very unlovely snort. "A certain amount of sincerity might help. Want some bread?" She tossed a crust at his webbed feet. Howard prodded the bread with his toe and found it as hard as the stone it had landed by. "This stale old thing?" he scoffed. His mother would never let bread get that stale. She'd toss it out to the animals rather than feed it to her family. Oh, Howard thought, realizing the old witch was doing just that. She suggested, "Dunk it into the water." The water was muddy and had geese swimming in it. Howard heard Sunset Dances Like Flames on Her Feathers getting introduced as more and more geese gathered. Howard heard the geese honks for one of a kind and beautiful and interesting. Geese did not strike him as being very original thinkers. "Your bread probably has weevils in it," Howard said to the old witch. She wanted a sincere compliment. He didn't need to compliment her at all when there was a whole pond full of gullible geese nearby. Besides, I'm not going to be a goose long enough to get hungry. The old witch shrugged, and Howard eased himself into the pond. He planned to wade in only as far as his short legs would permit, since he didn't know how to swim. But as soon as his goose body hit the water, his goose instincts took over. His feet began paddling, and in moments he was gliding away from the shore. He swam up to Sunset Dances Like Flames on Her Feathers and said, "Wow, you look even better in the full sun than you did back there in the shadow of the weeds." "Thank you," she said to him, between mouthfuls of watery bread. Howard watched the water squish out from her beak and waited for the spell-loosening sensation to start. Nothing happened. Maybe a compliment only worked once for each complimentee? Howard swam up to another goose. "You have very soft-looking feathers." "Thank you," that one said, though she sounded a bit timid, as though distrusting why he'd come up to her to say that. Still nothing. Maybe the compliment wasn't good enough. To another goose, Howard said, "The sparkles in the water cast sparkles in your eyes. Very becoming." "Thanks," said that goose, but she backed away from him warily as though he made her nervous. "My, you're such a good swimmer," Howard said to yet another goose. "I bet you could teach all of us a thing or two about swimming." The goose ignored him. "Love the shade of orange in your beak," Howard called out to another. That one lowered its head and hissed, a hiss Howard understood as, "Keep your distance, new youngling." Now it was Howard's turn to back up. He backed into Sunset Dances Like Flames on Her Feathers, who stopped in her bread gobbling to warn Howard. "That's Mighty Beak Bone Crusher. You probably don't want to get on his bad side." Mighty Beak Bone Crusher? Did someone with a name like that have a good side? This wasn't fair. Howard was trying to be sincere. He returned to the shore to see if that crust of bread was still there, because maybe he was going to be stuck as a goose for a little longer than he'd hoped. But both witch and bread were gone. All right. So think about what Howard is trying to do, which is give the compliments. But why did the first one work and the rest of them didn't? That's what I want you to think about. Why was the first one the real compliment? All right. Tomorrow is called Pond Life, so tomorrow is chapter 6.